Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome to my book corner. We have another book review for you today, and today's book is another recent release. This was released on October 10th and is Stay in the Light by A.M.Shine. Now, this is actually a follow up to Shine's other book, The Watchers, which was recently turned into a feature film. If you want my thoughts on the book itself, I will link it up at the top for you to go and check out. As always, we shall take a look at the story, the characters, the world building, as well as the presentation before I give my final thoughts at the end. So let's just dive straight into this one. So, as mentioned, the story from this picks up after book one, The Watchers, and we are reunited with Mina, one of the survivors of that book. At the end of book one, Mina was advised by Madeline, a friendly changeling, that she had to run and hide because she had been discovered within the city, to run to where there is sand and salt water. And, whilst not asking for too much of an explanation, Mina has done exactly what Madeline has advised and has pegged it to the west coast of Ireland, to a little rural Irish town near the sea, where she spends her days suffering immense trauma and a little bit of survivor's guilt, I think it's fair to say, after the aftermath of book one. And she spends her days marinating herself in whiskey, sometimes walking within the wilderness where there's very few people around, and then Google searching for more information on the Watchers, be that more sightings, historical evidence, just general research, because she believes that the Watchers are out there and looking for her. She needs to have one step ahead in case they ever discover where she is, which is indeed what happens in this book. Whilst she has made very few friends in the place where she lives, she does have a couple of landlords, as she very closely resembles their daughter, who is away in Australia. So her being around town would probably not cause too much of a fuss, but she's not really interacted with people. However, one day she spots some people on the beach that she doesn't recognise because it's a beach, so obviously one that people don't go to, and it's not really beachcombing weather. And she ends up having to go into town with one of the people who own the place where she's living, speaks to one of the local landlords, and somebody enters the bar, and she knows straight off the bat that something is wrong. From this point forward, everyone that Mina has met so far within the town is no longer human. They get replaced, and the chase is well and truly on. And what I like about this is this really does raise the stakes very, very quickly. Whilst you had a really slow build up and reveal in The Watchers, this doesn't need that level of general build up, due to the fact we already know what the Watchers are and the nature of them. We know what they can do. We know some of them, at least, have been within humanity for a long time. We don't know why they haven't done anything at this point, and that is kind of the curiosity and the mystery. If they can do these things and some of them are already out, why are they not attacking people? And there are occasional suggestions that this has happened, but they are few and far between. You then have the sort of the hunted down, the chase, and a bit of a cat and mouse game, before eventually Mina does get cornered, and you have a reunion with Madeline. But you do have a secondary story here, and what I find really interesting is the secondary story is a lot closer in pacing to the story of book one. This takes a look at Sean. So Sean is the son of the professor who'd been studying the changelings in book one, who had passed away by the time of the first book. And he has discovered a archaeological dig site that he thinks will prove once and for all that his father was correct, and he can be lauded for his discoveries of proof of this Irish folklore having elements of truth to it. And what you have here is the digging down into what they think might be a burial tomb, maybe an old communal hall underground. And there's several warning signs straight off that don't quite marry up with what happened again in the Changeling. And you have them slowly but surely beginning to inch their way through this underground, not quite a labyrinth, but underground structure where things don't quite add up. There's ancient relics under there. There's ancient writings in script which very few people can understand. And you very much have an argument of hubris with this character. And you have a reveal towards the end on his arc side that explains why the Watcher's nature is as it is right now and why all that war with humanity has not yet occurred. And it is a very, very clever twist. What's really interesting with these two is there's a massive difference in pacing. Even though they're taking part concurrently, you have a far slower build on the case of Sean's side, whereas Mina's is very much more action-heavy focused, although they both come to conclusion at the same point. And there's two twists in here in particular. Technically three, I suppose, but one kind of links to the other two. And both come through Sean's storyline. The story is very, very strong, and it is telling two distinct stories. Well, two distinct plot lines linking into one overall story. You have the story of the obsessed survivor, broken by trauma, finally being discovered and having to think on their feet and survive, a world which they hoped had escaped. And then you have the idea of the hubris of discovery at all costs, which is Sean's story. Very much driven forward by, I want to prove my father's work, I want to prove my work. The human cost doesn't matter. And these are both stories that we have seen elsewhere in other fiction, but they're both really well done here, and they intertwine very, very nicely. The focus of this in terms of character is clearly Mina and Sean. Mina is a broken husk of a character in many regards, as you would expect, being forced through the events of book one and then being forced to flee for their own safety. And very much they are in full-on survival mode. The only thing that really matters to them is the yellow one, the little yellow parrot that got her into the mess in the first place in many regards. So you have this character who is obsessed with the changelings for both their own safety and also to try and figure out what they're doing, who's become incredibly reclusive, very socially awkward, very anxious, and is marinating themselves in drink to help cope with everything that they've been through. But also someone who shows very honed survival instincts. And when these instincts do let her down, and she begins to start to let people in, that's when things start to fall apart, when the heart overrules the head in terms of judgment. And I like the way that this is portrayed until you hit a snapping point with the character and everything comes out. It's really well done, and there's a flip at the end involving her and Madeline that really does a good job of almost reversing the roles of who is the rock figure in this relationship, which is really, really well done and just shows a full squaring of the circle of Mina's arc over the two books. Now, in terms of Sean, Sean is very much kind of living in his father's shadow. His father was the preeminent researcher into Irish folklore, and whilst he's a highly regarded academic, he has none of the charisma that his dad had. But he's driven by the need to almost one-up what his father achieved in his life, to actually prove once and for all that the changelings or the fae, or whatever you choose to call them, are real. So you have this very academically driven individual who lacks a number of social graces. And this comes through with his continuous push in the excavation to a level which is, pretty harmful to the various volunteers that he's got helping him. And you see this lack of any real charisma to drive people forward, and other people have to step in. Those people have their own agendas as well to help drive this dig forward without people just abandoning ship. And this, again, comes from full circle, where the realization of the fact that everything that he's been working towards has not been what he expected it to be, and there's unforeseen consequences. And that moment of horror is, again, really strongly done as well. Well, there's two characters that cast a very long shadow over this story. The first one I want to talk about is Sean's father, David Kilmartin, who was the professor who had built the bunker underneath the coop in book one, who had done the majority of the work and had pretty much proven that all the myths around changelings and so on and so forth were true. Something obviously occurred and it never went quite out there. But it's his research and his obsession that has really driven Sean forward. It is the driving force for him and his inspiration of almost one-upmanship. And from that point of view, you have these constant callbacks to my dad was right all the way through. And it's almost like this feeling of wanting to get not quite parental approval, but almost to prove that they're worthy of the mantle of successor, which is kind of the driving force for a lot of it. And also there's a lot of information in here that is directly pulled from their research. The other side of the coin is obviously going to be the changeling herself, whose name I have just, Madeline, went out of my head for a second there. And again, Madeline isn't in the book that much until maybe the last third. Don't see her at all beforehand. But again, you have the things that Madeline has spoken about and imprinted into Mina has kind of kept Mina alive and given her a real sense of driving that survival instinct, which is very well done. And again, once you have the reappearance of this character later on in the book, you kind of have a switch of roles right at the end because of something that happens specifically at the conclusion and affects Madeline in particular. That you have a switching of roles from Madeline being almost a tutor and protector and the inspiration and the wise woman, and it kind of switches to Mina, and you have this switch of points, even if it may only be brief. We don't know, there's probably going to be a third book that is really, really well handled, and you see an almost, dare I say, human moment for Madeline in those moments, which really sort of accentuates the character that she's been up until this point of the book. That's really well done. Everyone complements each other really well. Everyone meshes together into their stories well. And it helps really drive the stories forward with a real personal twist. When you introduce a fantastical presence into a book, I do like deep lore and world building, especially when it comes to Fae folklore, and A.M.Shine absolutely delivers here with his inspirations and clear research that's gone into this. With mentions of things like the murder of Bridget Cleary in the late 19th century. Allegedly, Bridget was claimed to be a changeling according to their husband, to digging into the fact that their cottage was built on top of what was believed to be an old fairy fort, and then diving even deeper into what translates as the tribe of the gods or the Tuath Day. There was a clear understanding of Irish folklore and history here, which really does infuse the story with that mystical element and gives it a bit more weight than if it was just all made up or just badly handled, and it is handled really, really well. A lot of the information comes either through early on the research that is being done by Mina herself, but most of it comes directly pulled from the works that Sean is going through while they're doing the excavations and talking about the different writings and what they mean and how difficult they are to understand as they're now dead languages. And it links into the creation myths of these folk tales, and I absolutely love that. And it did send me down a bit of a rabbit hole, I'm not going to lie. I ended up doing a load of research myself because I love seeing stuff like this. Things like the murder of Bridget Cleary are very well known. They've made true crime podcasts. They've been the thing of research and shows. And clearly there's a lot of love for the source material here, which really does elevate this in my opinion. And that sort of attention to detail and that love entwines itself all the way around. And even though this isn't a direct representation of that folklore, it's pulling from folklore that has been inspired by that since, and it shows how the corrupting influence may have affected the changelings since their disappearance from the world and why they are as they are. It's really fascinating stuff. It's well worth deep diving yourself if you have any interest in folklore as well. This, more than anything else, is what elevated the book for me personally. on to the presentation next, and I want to spend a bit of time talking about the cover because at first glance, the cover seems to be very, very simple, and indeed it is. But Shine has done something with their covers on all three of their full-length books so far, be it The Watchers, The Creeper, or Stay in the Light, where the covers are almost entirely monochromatic. They are black, white, with shades of grey thrown in there, with the only colour being some of the key text around the author's name and some sort of taglines being in almost like a blood red. But also, all three books also have a mirroring effect on them top to bottom, which is really interestingly done. Book one, The Watchers, was the outline of a woman's profile side on, kind of made up from sketch drawings of trees, which fitted into the setting of the first book. And there's a very similar sort of effect with a cabin on book two, The Creeper as well. Stay in the Light takes the caged bird, and it has the bird cage top and bottom. And what I really like is that this is a really good analogy for the story itself, because in many ways, this is talking about how people get trapped. Mina is trapped by their experiences and their history and their trauma, as well as outside events. Sean is trapped by the legacy of their father and the determination to prove themselves worthy. The changelings in book one were trapped in the forest. And the other thing that's worth noting is that the darkness in the top of the cover has an open door, which shows that there is sometimes a way out of a cage if someone will open the door. And that bodes really interestingly for the story that's being told here. Now, in terms of the writing style, there's a number of interesting choices made. Initially with The Watchers, I found the start of it too lackadaisical and too overly prose heavy, and it felt like that died away as the characters' realities and comforts got stripped away, and it felt like by the end a lot more straightforward a script. And this feels very utilitarian in that way, and I don't mean that as an insult. I think this works really, really well to provide almost a raw feeling to Mina in particular. But also you have a really interesting layered level of pacing going on, because Mina's story and Sean's story are told in a very different rhythm. Mina's is very quickly jumps to high level and stays there in terms of its pacing and its dynamism. Is that a word? I don't know. It is now. Whereas you have a far more gradual ramp up when it comes to Sean's story. And that can sometimes not work, but it does work really well here because it gives you natural downtime without breaking each of the individual stories up. On top of that, there are a couple of point of view chapters in here that are not from Mina's or indeed from Sean's point of view, and that gives an added level of context to the story as well and gives us another fresh set of eyes, as well as potentially setting up some of the twists further down the line involving some of those characters, and it's especially well done. In terms of overall pacing, this clips along very nicely and is a lot more action heavy than book one as a rule of thumb, but it works really, really well. I read this in 2 sittings. The majority of it I read in 1. Really enjoyed it. It kept my attention. Brilliantly done. The writing, because it has such a deep dive as well into its folklore, it never quite feels like it's info dumping on you, which is another important thing, because quite often you'll get books where they're trying to give you information that the characters know, and it just feels like insert spiel here, and this doesn't feel like that, because it feels like natural conversation because of the people involved in the conversations and what they're talking about, and it gives us as a reader just enough information to figure out what we think is going on. That last bit is the key one, because what we think is going on, what is going on, are not necessarily the same thing, although there is a really good level of breadcrumbing going in through here. So when you have the switch at the end, whilst it may take you by surprise, one of them actually did take me by surprise, the other one not so much. There was foreshadowing earlier on in the book, which I really appreciate. Overall, this is a beautiful cover and a beautifully written title. So I'm pretty sure it's been pretty obvious, but I really enjoyed this. I gave this 4.5 stars out of 5 over on Storygraph, which is obviously rounded up to 5 stars on Goodreads. I am a sucker for folk horror. It's my preferred type of horror. I do like something with a bit of a slow burn and a little bit of action, and this delivers. I didn't necessarily think The Watchers needed a sequel. I was actually quite happy with the very ambiguous open ending, and I was fine with that. But as Shine has seen fit to continue the story, he's actually made the really sensible choice of mining down and taking those two separate elements of the story with the slow burn and the action heavy points and splitting them off and giving those two sides of the story to two separate characters. And what that gives you is two different things. It gives you a very much story grounded in the experience of the individuals whose point of view we're looking through. So you have the personal element, but you have an increase of scale from book one as well. And it does a really good job of setting up a further increase of scale for book three. And not just that, but especially in terms of Madeline and Mina, I suspect. There's a really interesting dynamic that I can see developing there as well, keeping it grounded in the personal affairs of the people involved, which I'm really excited to get to. I absolutely adored this. If you like well-researched, folk-inspired horror, then I think this may well be one for you. I highly recommend checking them out. I think A.M.Shine has just become one of my purchase on release authors after this one. But there we go. That's my thoughts on Stay in the Light by A.M.Shine. Have you read this or any of his other books? If you have, let me know in the comments below what you thought, and I'll catch you all very soon.